The problem is not knowing how to change it.
See it different.
The problem really is, I'm not sure if I want to change it.
Sure,
I
I
think-
don't want to.
I think what I really would like is to make my dream a perfect dream.
I would like that.
See? But that's not what's going to change anything. That changes nothing. We don't see the dream differently and change the dream. When you see a dream differently, the dream goes away, and we see what takes its place. But we're a little reluctant to take it on faith that the world that God has created is what we really want. We still believe that we can do a better job. Yep. And that's what hangs us up. That's why we don't go to the God Self, the Holy Spirit, constantly saying, show me how to see this differently. We think we know how to see it in a better light. And we're just really not that sure that we want what God wants for us. Anyone who chooses to see the face of Christ will see it. You won't have to ask how, because you will have made the choice. The choice to see it is the choice. And it's the only choice we need to make. Whenever I ask Brother to help me see differently, I have to be careful that I am being honest in wanting to see it differently and not just wanting a different outcome to what I already see. Some dear friends called yesterday and today because they have a situation with one of their children. He's not a child, he's 18 years old, who is having an issue with drugs and so forth. And they're being torn apart because essentially they want to see him without a drug problem. So what can you say to them realistically that will bring them a sense of peace? You've got to begin by telling them that the truth of their son is that he doesn't have a drug problem. He has a self-image problem, and you don't have a problem seeing your son differently. You have a problem seeing yourself differently. We can do one thing and one thing only, and that's to turn within and see the face of Christ, and then allow that to be what we see in the world. We, in short, need to constantly remind ourselves nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. And it's only there that we find the peace of God. I often ask myself, if I could have anything that I wanted, not believing that I already do, what would it be? What would it be? You see, if you don't take responsibility, you'll always be looking for something different. But once we do take responsibility and know that what we have is what we want, we can stop the judgment. What does it mean when we talk about vibrations? What does it mean when we talk about energy? What are we really talking about? We're talking about feelings here, categorically, right? Where do those feelings come from? See, many, many times when we talk about things of this nature, whether we're consciously doing it or unconsciously, we're attributing a source that's outside ourselves to where these feelings can arise and seem to motivate it. And the thing that I think we should pay particular attention to when that type of thing begins to happen is, where are we coming from? Because it's we who are providing the impetus for this thing we're calling vibration or energy or whatever it is. Because it's we who are creating anything physical in our experience. That's not the God self. That's not Holy Spirit or God or brother. That's us in our capacity as an ego being, experiencing something moving through us that we're calling energy. And it's really important for us to pay attention to that, because that's a way we have of speaking to ourselves through the medium of our body. And that happens to be at that particular time the very best way for us to connect or be connected to something moving within us. And so we need to pay attention to what that is and ask about it. Try to find out what it is that you're bringing to the table right at that moment. What's up for me right now that maybe my ego would like to continue to cloud over or muck up with some distortions here or distractions.
Does love have energy?
In the ego's vernacular, yes. It's the highest form of energy that we have. But does love in the reality of itself have an energy? If you describe or attribute anything physical to energy, to the nature of energy, then the answer must be energy. Well, but keep in mind what we're talking about here now are feelings that are being generated through our mind. Yeah, and in truth, spirit has no physicality. There is nothing physical. There is nothing, I emphasize that, nothing physical in spirit. Because anything of a physical nature must be a limitation. And that is impossible to the nature of spirit. Did you see that program on Nova here recently? With quasars and black holes and the vastness of the physical universe. And you could sit there and watch it for about 10 minutes and find yourself saying, well, wait a minute, you're going to tell me all of this is a dream? It is the ultimate proof that separation is real. We are quite brilliant when it comes to pretending to be dumb. But you just stop and think for a moment. The creative capacity of a mind that could even conceive of that type of thing, even in its most simplistic form. I mean, we would sit there and watch it. I sat there and watched it and said, there's no way I could be responsible for that. Nothing exists. Nothing exists in all of creation as we would know or imagine it that is not a product of who we are, who and what we are. Why is all of that significant? Because it tells us the power of our mind. It gives us some type of insight into the believability of what we have made, as opposed to what God's creation actually is. How many of us would like to create another world? I find myself going through periods with this COPD and other things that come up and thinking to myself, what is it that you really would like? And it's not too difficult to imagine. What I want is a perfect world where my ego can perfectly express itself and never be sick. That's the ultimate, isn't it? When we begin any thought process with a premise in mind, that premise itself is going to determine the outcome of the thought. So you're lost. You're immediately lost. You begin, as Tom was saying, from a place of wondering about me, and everything then automatically compresses to simply expressing a thought about me. So when you when you are wanting to expand the mind, we have only one, at least Brother tells us, we have only one source for doing that. And that is what we call the Holy Spirit, or the God Self. That's the thought that God put in our mind that totally is a total antidote for the ego's machinations. All of the ego's beliefs are suspended. When you bring in the awareness of the God Self, as much as you are able to hold that purely away, it suspends all of the other attributes, whatever you would like to call them, of the ego's perception. It's a totally different reference, totally. I think that's why, from what Brother has said, I think that's why God created the thing we call the Holy Spirit. It is that separate channel that totally bypasses the rest of the stuff.
Is that what you do when you tune in and get?
I don't know. What I do know is that the element of having the presence that I call brother in my life gives me an excuse to focus my awareness on that presence and accomplish, hopefully, a similar thing, which is suspending all my old beliefs and putting them out here in my focus on this thing I call brother. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't work, then this thing I call hearing seems to suffer.
Interesting word to use, Tom. Suspension of my belief system. Holding it in abeyance, stepping back, creating a space for that awareness.
Just listening to you describe it, it's perfect. Because that is exactly what we do. We condition our mind to move away from the norm. And when you do that, just as you were describing it, you do that, you open your mind, this mind that can do these marvelous things that we now have to see on Nova that looks like some kind of animation. You see, the power, that is the power of the mind, to step aside from itself. And that is so vitally important that we learn how to do that. We are searching for the nature of a being that is unknowable to our current perception. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
The nature of yourself, this self that we are searching for, is unknowable within the ego's perception.
Unknowable to the one that's searching.
I firmly believe that when he even speaks in terms of vibratory levels, for example, that he's talking about something not of a physical nature.
Yeah, I think so.
He's talking about opening his mind to
Higher.
to an awareness
Yes.
that is not available. What does he tell us in the very beginning of the book? What is the phrase that we refer to so frequently? About removing the block to the awareness of love's presence. All of that I refer to as the distractions are fundamentally necessary for the ego to preserve the nature of itself. It really is, because you see, everything that we are is omnipresent. Never goes away, never changes, nothing ever happens to it. It's always there. It's here right now, and nothing can change it. That is the nature of what we call God. So it's always there. So what do? This thing we're calling static is absolutely fundamentally necessary for our perception to maintain in order to feel safe. Because it is the purpose of that perception to preserve the nature of its separate self. Its separated self. Remember, the very story we have of the Garden of Eden, where God says, everything okay down there? Everything pretty perfect on there. Right. One tiny, small, mad idea crept into the mind of God's Son. That mind was, could I really? I don't care, ask any question. One's the same as all the rest. And suddenly, we superimposed something over the natural order of things and lost it. And everything that we study, everything that we try to do now, is aimed toward removing that one constant idea. Now, why don't we do it? Why can't we do it more easily? Because we still haven't come up with the belief that there isn't anything wrong with us. We're still pretending that there's something for us to be guilty about. And if you don't believe that, walk out the door and check out the first thing you look at and ask yourself if you made a judgment about it. We make judgments about everything. It's the way we think. It is impossible to be without thought because the nature of God is a thought. So you try to be without that? Come on. No, it's what you were saying, though. It's the content of the thought. It's the purpose that we assign the thought. We were complaining, or I was complaining a few mornings ago in my meditation. Brothers, why can't I seem to focus on things that are just loving? Why do I get so easily distracted toward the fearful things that keep coming into my mind? See, right there, I was talking about me. I was talking about an individual.
Yeah.
So what was his answer to me? Came back and he said, think of it this way for a moment. See yourself as a hitchhiker on the highway of loving. And sometimes you'll get picked up by a thought that seems loving. Sometimes you'll get picked up by a thought that doesn't seem loving. But you'll always be on the highway of loving. And doesn't that perfectly describe what we're talking about? Yes, it's the path.
Yeah.
That's the so-called path. If we confined ourselves to thinking of it strictly from the terms, not from the terms of how in the hell am I going to get off of this craziness, which is what I was asking him. Why can't I do this? Why can't I? Wait a minute. You don't need to go there. Just allow yourself to always begin with the premise that nothing is wrong. Not how to change what's broken, but how to fall back into that cocoon that nothing is wrong. Now let this magical, marvelous thing we call a mind do its real thing. And it will. You see, it'll walk down that road just like it walks down the road of how can I fix this broken thing that I am. Is there something just a step behind the feeling of wanting, a feeling that the Course describes as being deprived? Is there something, what is just behind that? I'm sure there's nobody here who would not acknowledge that your desires, your intentions for finding the truth are pretty strong. So what would evoke that kind of a phone call? The kind that would seem to be an attack of sorts upon you. What would seem to bring that about? Do you ever wonder that? When the Course talks to you about, like the lesson this morning was for me, a perfect example. If I gave up attack thoughts and I sat there and started thinking, I can't remember the last time I had an attack thought. Not true. Fortunately, I have this voice that sometimes has a tendency to tap me on the shoulder and say,
Yeah.
have you thought about
Talks
this?
to me too.
So I'm sitting there thinking, as I'm trying to think of the last attack thought I've had, I recognize that the mere fact that I'm sitting, believing that I'm in a body, in a world, where attack thoughts can occur, is an attack thought. None of us who gets a call like that, who gets a thought thrown at them like that, is immune to not having attack thoughts. None of us. We all have them. That's the point. It's become so normal to us that we don't even notice them anymore. So what can we do? What is the bottom line, most important thing that we can do to, let's say, offset these attack thoughts? The Course coordinates the text in the lessons. And we begin to go through this, as we begin to go through this series of lessons, in chapter 4, Brother tells us for the first time in the Course that if we were willing to surrender our attachment to attack thoughts, that he would take them over for us. And I can't tell you how many times it strikes me that I forget that. It becomes so apparent that the only reason that I would forget it is because I thought I could do a better job than what he was doing. I don't think anybody has had more of an experience of an offer to take over thoughts than I have with him, and yet I still do. So why? We don't trust enough.
Or any attack thought is a call for love, too. So
It's very
kinda like
important, Sam. It's very,
That's what
very
I-
important to recognize that.
Yeah.
When you become aware that you're turning to the God Self for help, do you have the feeling that you are not alone experiencing your problem, and that when you're asking for help, perhaps it could be helpful in, I don't like to use the word dimensions, but other spheres or dimensions, that you are also bringing help there? Do you have that feeling?
Yes.
I have a problem. When any of us have a problem, are we ever experiencing that problem, so-called, alone? Brother tells us that the only way we can realistically acknowledge what our true problem is to understand that we have no problems. To begin with that place that says I have no problems, and to be thankful for that, and then to allow that awareness to become the solution or the answer to our so-called problems. Before we can get quite to that place, to recognize that every time I think I have a problem or that there is an issue that I need to deal with, someone, somewhere else, in a simplistic way of understanding, is dealing with the same issue. What we're trying to do overall is to establish an awareness or a state of mind that begins to see everything connected instead of everything separately applied to our individual ego self. Everything. So there are no more separate problems. In fact, Brother goes further than that. He tells us that we only have one problem.
Thinking we have a problem?
Thinking we have a problem. Yes. The only problem we have is this belief that something could have happened that separated us from ourselves. That's it. Nothing else. Everything else is symptomatic of that one issue. So how do we learn then to begin to establish a state of mind that overcomes that in every circumstance and situation? The vigilance.
Yeah, vigilance.
And the vigilance comes by practicing on that one thing that we all face most predominantly. And that's the experience of the belief that there's something wrong with us. And that's the belief that seems to separate us from everyone else, because of the way we have of identifying with it. I have COPD, you have something, you have something, you have something else. So we've all got something different, right? No, wrong. We all have symptoms of the same idea that there's something wrong with us, and that somehow we have separated ourselves from our source. It would have been the same outcome, because what we're looking to do, and this is the point of all of this, what we're looking to do is to feel a sense of being united, connected, because that is the place where we can finally reconnect to what love is. We're all looking to be loved. Every one of us. That's the thing we want the most, is to know that we are loved. And yet what we try to do is to create circumstances and situations about things that are missing, that we'll feel better about ourselves. And it never works. It never happens. because we've failed to see that the one thing that makes us feel loved is to feel connected. That is the purpose of love, to feel connected. And without feeling connected, there is no love. Love doesn't exist in a vacuum. Love exists as the experience of our oneness. As strange as this may sound, Brother tells us that whenever we become aware of that thing that we want, which is the product of the dualistic mind, as you were saying before, rightly, as soon as you achieve it, then it kicks in and says, well, this is what it's like not to have them. We all know that. But when we recognize, even when we feel comfortable saying, this is what I really think I want, to go to the God self and say, what is it that I truly want? And when he answers that, to then take that into a place within us where we can ask God, or let's say, express to God our gratitude for having that thing. In other words, we're trying to change the awareness between having and not having. And the only thing that is different between having and not having is our inner willingness to admit we have it or to say we don't have it. Because nothing else is really in play. None of the things, none of the relationships, none of the loves or lack of loves are really what we're talking about. We're talking about our willingness to see or not to see. And so even when I'm looking to feel a connection or a sense of being loved, to go to the God self and say, help me express my gratitude for knowing that I am loved. Does it give you a different sense when you recognize that you're not the only one thinking that thought?
I'm not sure I recognize that.
How difficult will it be for you to begin to establish the habit of becoming aware that you are never alone in thinking whatever thought happens to be present in your mind at the moment? You feel that? Whoa. Is that going to be a comfortable place to go?
Are you saying when all thoughts are shared and that you're aware of it?
I'm saying, Sam, that even the Course tries to accommodate us on occasion by talking to us about all of the minds being joined. But in other places, and the real basis for understanding the truth is there is only one mind. It's not a collection of minds being joined. It's an experience of thought in one mind. Yeah, the brain has nothing to do with the mind. The two are just totally disconnected. The brain is the mechanism that makes the body work. And the mind is the mechanism which contains the awareness that there is a person trying to make a brain and a mind and a connection, an ego. I was describing a more general condition, a condition which allows us to just begin to cultivate an awareness that separation in any form is a myth.
It's impossible.
We can't be separate. We are a thought in the mind of God, and what isn't? Everything that lives is a thought in the mind of God. And as different as the thoughts we might try to make the thoughts, they're all occurring in the same place, where we are. Brother said to me, he said, sometimes when you're a hitchhiker on the highway to love, sometimes you get picked up by a thought of love. And sometimes it seems to be something else. But it's always on the highway to love. Always. In other words, there's only one place. There's only one road. One mind.
And it came to me years ago, all of us are on the spiritual path, and it doesn't really matter where you are if you're on the path, but it does matter which way you're walking.
See, Brian, to me, even that stretches me to a very uncomfortable place. If I'm in the mind of God, how many places, how many roads, how many ways to get there are there? It's done.
We're there.
It can't be a road to love or to heaven or to hell. It's just, heaven's the only destination there is. If I'm going that way, it's heaven. If I'm going that way, it's heaven. It doesn't matter. See, that's the moment that we're trying to get to recognize the inevitability, and please hear this, the inevitability of God. We don't have a choice.
To stay here, which is hell in my opinion, or to move toward God.
Or, as he's telling us in chapter 4, give up the need to be in control.
Yeah.
Give up the need to choose.
Yeah.
Turn it over to him and say, okay, you probably know a little bit more than me, so you go ahead. Well, the Course teaches us that
Yeah.
the basis for all perception is comparison. That's how the ego thought process functions, is through comparison. So as you evaluate someone else, what are you doing? You are evaluating how they compare to you, your image of yourself. So the question is, do I give them a positive or a negative evaluation if they're more like? If I walked into a room, you and I meet for the first time, and without even recognizing what I'm doing, I'm evaluating, I'm comparing
Yeah.
you to me. And now let's say I decide that you're just like me. Does that make you good or bad?
That's a tough question.
As a matter of fact, it is. Because sometimes we judge people, or we are gravitating toward people because we have decided they're not like us. And we would rather be like we think they might be rather than like ourselves. What the Course tells us is that either way, all we're doing is comparing them to who we think we are. Wanting to share with you, with the group here, a feeling I had this morning in my meditation. I was wondering, what came to me was, in reading, going back now and rereading the text as well as the lessons, in chapter 5, the opening statement is very peculiar. Not peculiar, but I had forgotten it, let's just say that. To heal is to make happy. Out of all of the other things that we've studied about healing, I have totally spaced the awareness that the very basis for all healing is the willingness to be happy. So I was thinking about that in my meditation this morning, wondering if I could identify the self that was resisting being happy, which of course leads you to the old who am I, where am I, what am I query of the ego. So I just sat with that, trying to identify, or being open, let's say, to being willing to identify a self that was willing to be happy. And a lot of thoughts started flowing across the screen about, well, the ego can't be happy. The ego self is this and the ego self is that. That's okay, I'm not looking for the ego. I'm not trying to find the ego self. And I just sat there and almost, I don't know how long, but in a little bit, this little light way off in the distance came. And it just started coming toward me. And it got to a place where, I don't know where, but it stopped. And I was sitting there looking at it with the feeling of utter joy. It was just the most beautiful thing that I have ever seen. But the thing that I became aware of was that I wanted to join with it. I really wanted to join with it. And when that happened, I knew that was myself. That was the self I'd been looking for. I wanted to join with it. It wasn't a self that I rejected. It wasn't a self that resisted being happy. It was a self that I really wanted to join with. And I wondered how many times when I have looked for a self or tried to understand myself or whatever, that I've been confining it to this self, this body ego, and not opened my mind to this other self. Oh, the other thing, the other part of it was that as soon as I recognized that I wanted to join with it, it just exploded. Just exploded. And it went everywhere. Just everywhere. It just covered everything. And I could feel, that's what reminded me of it today, I could feel that this was an experience of my oneness. I became aware at the same time that it was because I wanted that feeling of wanting to share this, wanting to join with it and to share with it, that I recognized what my real purpose was in the world. Even though this is not a self that I could identify with as of this world, it very clearly was evident that it was the desire to love. Makes us all who we are. There is no other purpose for us. And when that explosion happened and that light went everywhere, it was just very nice. That brings you to the place where your mind can then transcend the ego awareness, yes.
Okay.
It's a very tricky thing, incidentally. We're all aware of how quickly our mind can go from one to the other, back and forth, back and forth. And it does this constantly because the mind is split. Keep in mind what we're dealing with here, that we're calling an ego mind, is the mind of God. It's the only mind that is. And the only thing that's happening is that we're rotating awareness, turning the switch from on to off. But it's all happening. All of that is taking place in the mind of God. It's just the notion that it's split that gives us the wrong experience of it. That's all. The perception that it's split, yeah. Because it's not really split. It's just a perception.
Sometimes it gets more confusing before it gets clear.
It does. And when that happens, honey, we've always got the one fallback position that never fails. You just, for me, I just stop and say, whoops, wait a minute, I've forgotten. What is it that I want? Oh, I just want to feel loving. Let the rest of it go. Why does it require revelation, direct communication with God in order to experience pure joy? Maybe that's because pure joy only exists in the awareness of God. Does that help to clarify when the Course, as it does consistently, tell us that in our awakening, the last step is taken by God? In other words, in our devotion to God, in our determination to express love, we can do it to the extent that perception can understand love. And if we carry it to the point, let's call it or define it as unconditional love that isn't affected by behaviors or anything else. Now we've pushed it to the outer limits of how perception can understand love. It is so close to the reality of the love of God that God can then reach across that gap and bridge it. Now we say it's so close, God can do that, but in reality, we are so close that we can hear God do that. Having the mind so open that there is nothing there to interfere with the direct communication, what is called the revelation of God. For the first time, I felt there was a way for me to understand what it means to to love myself. I've always resisted that thought, like to love myself. What self? My ego? It was always very difficult. But when I saw something, this light, and I wanted to join with it, I wanted it, there was no resistance. It was just, yes, that must be the real me.
So the flow of God's love closed that gap.
I think so, honey.
Yeah.
That's the way I interpret
Yeah.
it. But when our reluctance becomes so tiny that there is nothing really standing in the way, then we are available to accept God. The key line in that last paragraph is at this point that sufficient quantitative change occurs to produce a real qualitative shift. In other words, that we are closing that gap. We are literally letting go and letting go and letting go. All of the blocks, the obstacles to our awareness of love's presence, to where the obstacles become so minute that they don't seem to be there. And then what has always been true, totally true, is seen. And when we see it, we say, my God, why couldn't I see this before? Why have I been so blind? You know, one of the things, if we really pay attention, one of the underlying things that we're learning about the Course, about this one-minded business, the fact that we all share the same awareness and that we all want the same thing. And if you begin to really tune into what that's teaching us, is that we are all here in support of one another. And when we wonder about the direction to go or the things that will best help us, if we just stop a moment and look at the world and say, what are you telling me? What's here for me to see? We can literally begin to accept that all of our thinkings are melded, every one of them, and every one of them is there to help us. None of them are random or by accident. And then I have this happen, so it's more unusual for it not to happen, but this morning was a typical example. I shared this meditation that I had. Just before that, I had this insight that I thought, wow, this will make a nice post. This will really be interesting. So I sit there and I wrote it all out, put it down, and went back into my meditation. Or just before I did, Linda said, I've just gotten this beautiful insight I'd like to share with you. And I kid you not, she off of her notepad read to me almost word for word what I had written. To me, it's just a perfect illustration of each of us doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. We're here to just help one another do it, that's all. Yeah. I stopped opposing you, I could allow you to help me. Just think for a moment what the basic teaching of the Course is. That we are always as God created us from the moment of our creation. Nothing has ever changed. And yet here we are, as we are approaching, I mean, I don't know how long any of the rest of you have studied the Course. I've studied it for about 40 years. And as I'm approaching the end of what I'm calling, and just listen to my description, the end of this physical life, why is that seen to be such a necessary thing? Why does the body die? Now we know that the body is not the creation of God. It's our creation. Why did we create it? The body becomes a symbol for several things, doesn't it? To be different is certainly one of them. It's primarily a symbol for our separateness. So what does separateness entail? Separateness is brought on by the concept of guilt. That's what makes us want to feel a need to be separate. To have someone else to project what's wrong with us. Okay. So what if, and we all struggle now, not a person here who doesn't believe they are a body, not a person in the world who doesn't believe, in the entire world who doesn't believe they are a body. They wouldn't be here if they didn't. So why do we make it so much more difficult on ourselves? By struggling to either one of two things, maintain the body or feel like we should get rid of it. How many of us believe that to really recognize the truth of ourselves, we have to let the body go? Is that really the truth? Why does the belief that for me to know the truth of myself, I must be free of the body, or I must let the body go?
It seems as if it were our holy mind, we'd be occupied with reality, not illusion.
I'm not sure I understand that, Roger.
Body is an illusion. The holy mind has no use for that.
But that's just the meaning we're giving it, isn't it? What if we gave it a different meaning?
The meaning we're giving the body or the holy
Yeah.
mind?
Yeah, the body. What if the body became, let's say, a symbol of my willingness to love? Who says it can't, incidentally?
That without the body, we are not sure that we could communicate.
The only reason for that, Jim, is that we're not sure of what we would want to communicate, being in that transition place between guilt and no guilt. Now we know what to communicate. We communicate to one another that there's something wrong with you. Maybe with me, but we'll get into that later. But certainly there's something wrong with you. And that's why you're there and I'm here. Right? If we presumed for a moment that the purpose of our body was to be simply to demonstrate to us that there was another way that we could be loving to everyone else who believes they are also a body. So we just give that as a new meaning to our body, and we absolutely believe it and accept it now. But if I gave my body the purpose of demonstrating that it could be a loving communication with other bodies, then why would my body have to be a limitation?
It's
See,
not
I'm no
eternal.
longer using it to be separate.
Not eternal.
What makes it not eternal? The body is our creation. It's by the standards of the Course. It's part of our dream, right? So let's be clear. What we're talking about here is the transition between dreaming and not dreaming. Okay, anything that would involve the experience of separateness, regardless of the purpose we gave it, is going to be part of our dream. So what we're trying to examine here is why we are so intent on making things so much more difficult during that transition time. And the two premises that we're taking a look at are, number one, that the body is a symbol of our separateness, and therefore it has something to do with our being guilty. So while we are spending all of our time focusing on whether or not we are going to accept our body, why not make it easier on ourselves and give the body a different purpose, give it the purpose of communicating love, and now let us change our mind without feeling a sacrifice in giving up the body. How many people do we see around the world who are suffering? Physical, whether it's illness or the effects of war or whatever, who are really seriously experiencing something that, in my way of thinking, is going to make their awakening to the truth of themselves very, very difficult. Very difficult. So what I'm suggesting is, if we were to change this whole soup of being a body or not being a body, and stop making the body such a symbol of our limitations and our unhappiness, why not make it something else? I can recall having conversations in the past with Brother about, gee, wouldn't it be nice if we could just sit together in form? And hearing him say, what makes you think we're not? And so I start thinking, what is there perhaps here that I'm not seeing? Which is why I think this kind of a discussion can be very, very helpful. If we are to believe, truly believe, that we are creating the world we see, then you tell me what there is about the world we see that we aren't in charge of changing. In fact, Brother even demonstrated that when he was, right after the time of his crucifixion, when he appeared and some saw him physically, and some didn't. So it served one purpose or another for different people. But it wasn't as though one thing happened and the other didn't. What if our belief changed? What if we could simply, purely focus on the reality of our atonement? In other words, that we are the infinite child of God right now, and that's not going to change. So why bother going through the birth and death process over and over again? You know, in this reincarnation thing that we do, each time we come back in, there's a certain amount of starting over again. Wouldn't it make more sense to think we don't want to do that anymore? We just want to stay till we're done. For me, to try to avoid dying serves about the same purpose and function as, well, trying not to and trying to amount to the same thing.
You're putting your mental attention on death.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's all about that then. It's all about the dying process. And the point that I was wanting to make was that's really not what it's all about. But that's where the ego wants to keep us. Because that's the ego's greatest fear. So what if we could put all of our focus and attention on being the atonement? Using the principle of what the Course teaches, the atonement, healing is the atonement from the Course's perspective. So, yeah, what if we could just focus on being open to the truth? I'm not going to find as much resistance to that because that's not as threatening to my ego. I wonder how differently I would see someone that I loved who was experiencing what we might call a fatal physical experience. Well, I think back on, for instance, my father, who I loved enormously, and feeling the helplessness when the doctor said, you know, his time now is very limited. He's going to die very shortly. And the helplessness, hopelessness that I felt. And I wonder if I believed that it was not necessary to die, if I wouldn't have been in a different state of mind when I was witnessing him have that experience. But you see what I'm beginning to get at? That for any of this, if we as a group decided that, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, there's no need to die. There's no need for the body to die. There's no need for us to forget and then start over again and go through the learning curve. We would have to find a way to see the meaning of life in an entirely different context. What would you do? How would you see yourself and how would you see the world? That's what's going to make it change. Us seeing it differently is going to make it, it's the only thing that can make it change. We can transport our body with our mind. Brother did that all the time. I had a friend, the fellow who introduced me to spiritual thinking, used to transport himself, his body, from place to place.
Are you transporting your body or your mind?
The mind simply envisions itself in being in another place, and the body is, well, we're beginning to talk about and identify some of the reluctances and resistances, or reasons for our reluctance and resistance to joining. Would we have this thing we call an ego if we had no resistance to joining? No, the ego is the issue of separation. The experience that I shared with you, I think last week, about being in a meditation and asking to experience the atonement and seeing this light way off in the distance coming closer and closer. And the feeling that I had when it stopped was that I didn't want it to stop. I wanted to be a part of it. That's, to me, that was signifying what oneness really is. My desire to be a part of it, not to push it away. It's also what's making me now recognize, based upon what we've discussed here today, why when I say, well, but there are still things here that I don't want to let go of. Even though I have that desire to experience the joining, that if the body was no big deal, then why not? Keep in mind, again, the body is a symbol. It has only the meaning we give it. And so as long as I believe that it's serving some, whatever its communicating purpose or whatever purpose for me, then why not? Why should I not embrace it? Not as who I am. Not as who I am.
But as your vehicle.
However we might describe it, Jim. Our letting go or feeling a need for the body to die, rather than just at some point saying, okay, I don't need this anymore, and setting it aside, is as much a hindrance to our accepting the atonement as it is saying, well, I must have my body in order to survive. One is the same, essentially the same as the other. But it's just always troubled me that there was one thing in our consciousness that we all took for absolute fact, and that's called death. And somehow, some way, we got to let that go. So maybe we could just begin to do this. As part of our listening and learning process, we begin to ask the God Self, how would I see this if there were no death? How would I see this, meaning a circumstance, situation? How would I see this without the belief in death?
It seems if you truly believed that there was no death, you'd have to be looking with Christ's vision.
Well, let's hope so. Okay, are we agreed? What we're going to do when we ask for help and guidance is to ask the God Self how we would see differently or in other situations if we did not have the belief in death. The ego would like to jump in immediately and begin to make its case for preserving the body. And that's not what we were saying. That's not what the concept is about. Even in the ego's awareness, death is not about preserving the body or letting the body go. Are you aware of that? What would it be like for you if you knew there was no death of the body? We have a lot of concepts that we are learning about. And these concepts are normally head-to-head with our beliefs. We can say, I am not a body. We can say, I am free without the body. But how many of us actually feel that way? In other words, the greatest danger in any learning process is that you allow the learning to get ahead intellectually of where you are emotionally. You have to live with your belief that you have now and then be able to change it. But you won't change it as long as you are still finding a reason to deny it. And that's what I'm trying to suggest when I'm asking us to be more consciously aware of what the belief in death does for us. Would you be willing to have God come and sit in the middle of this table right now? Be sure, because you see, the biggest, most fundamental thing that holding on to the body represents is not allowing that to happen. The body is the symbol of our willingness, our need to be separate.
It's time for us to go home. We're late.
What's wrong with this as a home? What comes up for you when I say that? What's wrong with this world as being your home?
Not a thing.
That's the only answer with which we can actually consistently be comfortable. If the Course teaches us, if what the Course teaches us is true, that we are okay just exactly the way we are right now, then what's wrong with this?
It seems like depends on how you look at it. The I, who's the I that's looking?
Is there, the fundamental question, Raj, is there ever anything to change except the way I see it? Here's the distinction. To say to yourself, there is a better place for me to go, puts you automatically into conceptualizing of what that place is or may not be. And you're going to struggle with it. You're always going to struggle with it because there will be something there that is unknown. But if you said to yourself, just where I am right now is the only place I can be, then your mind says, well, but if I don't like it, what can I do about it? Maybe I can see it differently. You see, now we've brought ourselves around to an entirely different way of trying to go from A to B. How are you ever going to be willing to be here as long as there's someplace else to go? But then sometime or another, and I'm told this began in our consciousness several years ago, we must be willing to ask the question, why? If we are the ones creating this experience, why have we not let that one go? Obviously, it still serves some purpose for us. So let's continue to make that the one option that we can all exercise. However, in whatever form or lack thereof, love best appears to us in any given moment. That's what we choose. So if we choose not to be absent while we're going through the awakening process, then let's choose that. How would you define holiness? If there's nothing my holiness cannot do, how do you define holiness?
Oneness.
Okay, anybody else?
Wholeness.
Wholeness, holiness.
Except
Because you'll come to understand that what he's saying here is that he's not making a statement that there's nothing the ego cannot do. It's this business of accepting our holiness.
So what does that mean, to be holy?
To me, it means the willingness to be perfectly loving regardless of circumstances or situations.
I have 5 brothers. Some I like better than others, but I love them all. I can love people I don't like. I can love people I hate. You know, you keep going with this. I can love everything. That's where you end up.
I would just suggest a note of caution there. Much of that has to do with the ego's need not to completely surrender its idea of unlovability or its idea of sin. Because in each case, when I look at a brother that I could like more than another brother, what I'm doing is evaluating which one of them best exemplifies my characterization of being sinless. And of course, that's the only thing, again, coming back, always wanting to bring ourselves back to the only point of beginning that has any meaning whatsoever. Nothing needs to change but the way I see. As I'm studying the lesson for today, I have a strange inner flash of recognition I can only describe as oneness. I ask brother for help. I hear, and this is strange the way he starts off, I do not exist without you, as you do not exist without Linda. Yet because God's thoughts of himself, God's thought of himself is complete, there is no part of his thought that does not contain the whole thought. The whole must be the same as each part. This is why your idea of separation has no meaning. Nothing exists outside of what is whole. Think about that. I mean, how obvious can you be? How can something exist beyond what is being whole? Nothing can be outside of what is complete. You can only imagine breaking up what is whole, but there are infinite ways to express it. You can only imagine breaking up what is whole. Love is the one feeling that frees the mind to comprehend this awareness. Therefore, nothing in truth exists outside of love. You are the presence of love, as am I. Nothing exists outside of this thought, and everything within it is you, and me, and Linda, and John, and Mary, and God. I sat with that for a long time, and the first thought of my own that seemed to come through was remembering this poem of Rumi's, where he talks about out beyond all thoughts of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. I hesitated quite a long time before I came to the conclusion that I'd like to share that with you, because I'm not sure I understand yet exactly what it means. So maybe you can think about it, and if anything comes through to you or for you, why. The flash I had before all this began was a feeling of one and infinite and one and infinite, going back and forth, interchanging with itself, and yet never changing. And I still can't, that doesn't begin to describe it. But how can we feel a sense of our oneness without giving up the self that we all know? It's just utterly impossible. The thing is, we can do it a lot closer to home than that. It's up to each of us to hold those thoughts and turn them over to the God Self to use wherever they're going to be most beneficial. We have as much power, as much influence, I should say, to change the way things are going as the kids or the Congress or anyone else. All we need to do is decide what it is that we want to accomplish. And when the answer to that quandary comes back by saying, what I want to know is how what God created me to be, and I allow that awareness to come through, that takes care of everything else. Nothing else then remains unanswered for anyone as soon as they are ready to hear it. I had kind of a surprising comment in my meditation this morning from Brother that I'll share with you. The lesson today was instrumental in my trying to focus my meditation on my purpose, my function. And I said to Brother, would you help me to reaffirm what I really want as my purpose is to be more loving? And he said, for that to be real, you're also going to have to open your willingness to being loved. That you can't experience one without the other, and ultimately come to the recognition of what oneness is all about. It was very helpful. It's silly to think about loving when you don't feel loved, because it has no meaning. I mean, you can't give it without getting it, and you can't get it without giving it. One thing we all can have a little more trust in, and that is being in the right place at the right time. There's never a question or a coincidence about that happening.
Yeah.
Only when we're unavailable to see it the way it's happening. So if you're there and you're in a place where the thought comes into your mind, then follow that thought. Follow that thought. That's how the God Self speaks to you all the time. Just constantly being with you and being in your mind and offering you thoughts that are going to make you happy. It might be helpful for us to review what the ego really is. What is the ego?
Tiny mad idea.
A tiny mad idea entered the mind of God's Son. And he forgot to laugh. It's my idea of myself. And suddenly, I began to live the idea and forget about the self. I have an idea about me that's not true. But gradually, sometime over the last whenever, I began to identify with the idea and I forgot about the self. So what happens? We get to a point to where we forgive the concept that led to the idea. And when that is no longer serving any purpose for us, then the idea itself simply merges. Or goes back into the self. The concept that there's something wrong with me, that I made a bad decision, that God is angry with me, that all of that crud that produces guilt. And it's the guilt itself that is the wedge between the idea of me and me. The guilt is gone through forgiveness. Now there's no longer any purpose served for that idea to exist apart from me. And so it just is gone. We say merge or whatever, but it's gone. And that's what the Course means when it says you take this whole journey, cross all of the so-called timelines and everything that we've experienced, this idea of separation, and suddenly they're gone, and what do you discover? Well, nothing has ever really changed. Nothing has changed. So I am where and what I have always been. So let me encourage you during this next week. Focus on that. Take some time and really try to come to an awareness first of what you consider your function to be. That's a big step, because most of us don't believe we're important enough to have a function. Come to the conclusion of what your function is, and then truly ask if you are willing to assume that function. Because that is the core of most of our consternations. Most of our angers, most of our sickness come about directly as a result of that. I can remember some time ago when I first asked Brother about that, asking him, what does it mean to have what appears to be all these different parts of myself being drawn and pushed and pulled? And he said, how do you feel when you hear my voice? Well, it's your voice. And he says, and that's not a part of you? The more then that I began to think about it, analyze it, it's as though anything that I connect with, anything that I so-called hear or see or what have you, must be a part of me, because one of the most basic lessons the Course teaches us is that everything in the world is simply an extension of how you see yourself. It's all about you seeing yourself. So anyway, a later part of that conversation was about purpose, not function, but they're the same, so it doesn't matter. And I was saying, well, is it my purpose then to try to integrate these things? And he says, well, always used to drive me crazy. Is that what you would like to have it be? Because again, it's even in the Course when he says God's purpose for you is your purpose. You can't separate your purpose from God's purpose. So let's apply that to our function. And if that's true for our purpose, then it must be true for our function. So how many of us could stop and consider the possibility of having our function be the same as God's function? How does that feel? How would you, on the one hand, if someone were to ask you what is the function of God as you understand it, would you be able to substitute yourself in that same scenario? Let's take the shooting that occurred in Florida. We have courage enough. Do we ask ourselves how God would see that, what God's function would be in those circumstances? I think all of us have experienced being in a somewhat depressed state. and have called upon the God self and found ourselves able to be free of it. And so how can we ever go through that experience without recognizing that it's always present? No matter what our state of mind is, it's always available to us to be in the God self state of mind. A few minutes ago, when I first asked the question about could you see yourself or substituting your self-image in the place of the God image in saying whatever your function or wondering whatever your function might be, that wherever I am, if I were to be able to more closely feel embraced by the God self presence, wouldn't that tell me that I can never actually be free of it?
Why would you not accept that all there is love?
But it's also saying that this one who does the plan recognizes that we're in a state of mind that needs a plan.
Yes, there you go.
Exactly.
Well, if God is love, then God's function, I think, must be to extend love. And the Course says that our function is forgiveness, because we can't extend love unless we forgive, unless we accept the atonement for ourselves, which gets rid of the guilt that you're talking about. So I see that our function is the same, because we're loved too.
Yes.
The Course tells us that.
So we should be able to think of, at least, interchangeably, our function and God's function as being the same.
Yeah.
But it's different in time than it is in eternity. In eternity, our function is to love and create. In time, our function is to forgive.
Yes, in eternity,
Heal.
in eternity there is no
Accept.
distinction. We're not sitting here talking about us and God. There just is. Wasn't that what Brother said that day? Hitchhiker on the highway to love.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes you get picked up and
Sometimes they pass you right by.
they pass you by, but you're always on the highway.
Yeah.
I think all of us have experienced being in a somewhat depressed state and have called upon the God self and found ourselves able to be free of it. And so how can we ever go through that experience without recognizing that it's always present? No matter what our state of mind is, it's always available to us to be in the God self state of mind.
Oh, I see.
A few minutes ago, when I first asked the question about you see yourself or substituting your self-image in the place of the God image in saying whatever your function or wondering whatever your function might be, that I were to be able to more closely feel embraced by the God self presence, wouldn't that tell me that I can never actually be free of it? What we're saying is to merge ourselves with the experience that the Holy Spirit represents, which is the truth. In mind, that would be a more accurate way of trying to describe it. Just allowing yourself to merge with that thought and become the presence of the thought of truth. But, there's a good thing to keep reminding ourselves. The Course constantly talks about salvation. How would you describe salvation? What is salvation to you? How about total acceptance of yourself? Begin there. Total acceptance of yourself. If there were nothing more in this entire universe than yourself, then your acceptance of it would bring it into your awareness. That is the atonement.